Let's talk about
politics, environmental science,
global warming,
constitutional rights,
social and economic challenges,
money, power, choice.
Nature does not compromise.
Extreme droughts, extreme heat waves.
Sea levels are rising, and it is
about climate change.
This is the future of the next generation.
And welcome to Let's Talk About Climate, a podcast where we talk about climate change and how it relates to all of us. Join us, #ChangeTheChamber Fellows, as we talk with scientists, grassroots campaigners, politicians, and more as we open up the conversation on climate. I'm your host, Erica Pietchak, and I'm here with my co-host, Matthew Ratner. We are joined today by Dr. Jay Golden, the inaugural Pontarelli Professor of Environmental Sustainability and Finance at Syracuse University. Jay is an internationally recognized researcher and academic on the dynamics of the global sustainability transition, including risks, unintended consequences, and opportunities. Jay received his PhD in engineering from the University of Cambridge, professional mastery of project management certificate from Stanford, MLE in higher education from Harvard, and a BA degree in management. He has more accomplishments than I can fit into this podcast, but one of the greatest is that in 2017, Jay was nominated by his peers and appointed to the Board of Scientific Counselors for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. He is currently the founder and faculty director of the Dynamic Sustainability Lab at Syracuse University. Thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome. Hey, but I got to give a shout out to one of the institutions you forgot to mention. I got my master's in environmental engineering and sustainable development at University of Cambridge and MIT. So I'm a MIDI also.
Awesome. So I'll start off with our first question. One of the biggest current ESG topics is net zero emissions or net zero carbon. With new technologies, new policies, and new thoughts, this goal is becoming more likely every year. Rapid industry commitments are coming from all types of organizations. President Biden even committed to a lofty goal of a net zero economy by 2050. You at Syracuse are working with governments, farmers, and industry to leverage agricultural wastes, and forestry to develop low carbon and climate smart feedstocks, chemical fuels, energy, and consumer products to aid organizations in achieving their net zero carbon transitions. What does it actually mean when a business commits to being net zero? And how can businesses achieve this goal?
So what does it mean? Well, it means different things to different people, and I'll kind of go into that. And for those who are listening to the podcast, be skeptical. We want this to happen, but go into it with your eyes wide open. It's really talking about reducing and absorbing. So when we talk about, and I'm sure many of your listeners know, when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions, we're talking about the various types of greenhouse gases, right? Carbon dioxide, methane, et cetera, nitrous oxide, et cetera. And we put it in scopes 1, 2, and 3. There's an accounting way. It's just like accountants do for taxes. Well, we have formulas that everybody follows for the accounting of greenhouse gases. And so when a CEO or a president says we're going to be net zero by 2050, what they're actually saying is we are still going to produce greenhouse gases through our operations, whether it's transportation, the largest sector in the United States for emissions, or industry, energy, et cetera, agriculture. But we're either going to find technologies and organizational strategies that can reduce those emissions, like Scope 2 emissions. We're going to start using renewable electricity versus, let's say, coal or natural gas. Or when they can't achieve all of it just by new strategies and technologies, then what they're going to do is absorb it. So right now, mostly through forest and voluntary carbon markets. In the future, moving forward, we just got a large investment by the US government to invest in carbon capture sequestration, or carbon capture utilization and sequestration. Or people are looking to the oceans for potentially being a place for long-term storage of it. So if we think of the old-fashioned scales where you put, let's say, your apples on one part of the scale, and you put weights on the other so they're equal, that's what we're talking about. We're going to equalize and have an equilibrium where the emissions that we're trying to reduce, that we still can't get to zero, we're going to offset with carbon markets or other types of ways to sequester the carbon. And I say be skeptical. If Erica is the CEO of Company X, it's really easy for her to make the comment, we're going to be net zero by 2050, because Erica knows probably by about 2035, she's going to be taking her $10 million a year salary and have a beautiful home in Barbados or somewhere. And it's the next person, it's Matthew's problem. So there's a lot of commitments, much of it for marketing, much of it for real. Companies are actually making progress, but to the extent that they can actually achieve net zero by a certain date, and they're rushing 2015, some are saying 2045, 2040, we as consumers, you especially, all those who are listening, who are the most important in all of this, because it falls upon your generation to keep track of this and hold organizations accountable, but also, more importantly, be the change agents going into government and industry and be those that actually can come up with the new strategies and technologies and make this happen.
Great. So how is this affecting jobs and connections between businesses, such as within their supply chains?
It's impacting significantly, right? Most organizations, so I come back to those scopes, scope 3 is primarily your supply chain. And so now companies and organizations and governments are trying to understand the climate impacts from their supply chain and suppliers. A company like Walmart has 66,000 tier 1 suppliers, and they're tier 1. The closest to them are organizations we know of, right? It's Nike, it's Procter and Gamble, it's Apple Computers, all those. And then they have many, many, many different levels of supply chains. So it's very hard to get that information. But there's greater pressure now because of these commitments, as well as regulatory actions that are going to require closer working relationships. And most importantly, probably the biggest word in all of this, ESG or climate, is transparency. So much greater transparency. And it is going to affect jobs. If we think of just the transition to electric vehicles, why are we going to have gas stations, right? EVs last longer, so they with lower maintenance. So we're not going to have as many people needing to repair cars. We're going to have shifts in the type of people that obviously manufacture the vehicles. We're going to have new industries to make lithium batteries. We're going to have new industries for people not only to build electric vehicle charging stations, but new businesses to service those. Because we all know if you have an EV, sometimes those chargers don't work. So for many of the listeners, you don't have to necessarily be a change agent and find opportunity just for, I want to come up with the next battery or work in that. There are so many service-related organizations, including obviously thought leaders and consultants, to go into organizations and help them think through these strategies.
That's great. Kind of building off of that, your organization's annual report last year brought up how governments and industry are rapidly transitioning to a net zero carbon economy, and at the same time developing a generation of sustainable technologies and strategies. Yet much of this is happening without the full understanding and quantification of the unintended consequences and risks, as well as opportunities. What does the new focus on ESG mean for national security and international trade for the United States, and what unintended opportunities as well as consequences could this transition present us?
Sure. So there are a lot. That's really what we focus on. We don't advocate for one thing or the other. What we advocate is for really good science and data to inform decision makers so they can just make the best decisions based on what they need to do. Well, if we just start off with the renewable energy and electric vehicle transition, to get to where we want, we are in need of critical minerals. Some of them are rare earths, which aren't really rare, but the category. But these are a number of minerals and metals which are critical to the ability of the country to be able to produce the materials needed for the turbines, for the batteries, for the chargers, for the number of electronics in the vehicles themselves. And unfortunately, we don't actually have the mines, the minerals that are financially viable for extraction, nor do we have the processing. China, for instance, and this isn't an anti-China statement by any means. China actually, in their 5-year plans, recognized this years ago and made the dominance, if you will, in regards to not only the extraction but the processing of these critical minerals part of their national security, and they have done an incredible job. So the United States and other countries are faced with that, as are other countries. For lithium, we talk about the lithium triangle, which is in South America. So it can affect our relationships with other countries as we compete. And we are going to be competing with other countries for access to these minerals and metals. Our national security, these minerals is vital to our economics and jobs and trade. So that's why I think the Inflation Reduction Act was a very positive, because it's propelling the United States to get ahead of other nations to be a global producer of green technologies, so that we can have that ability to enter markets for trade and create jobs, meaningful jobs in the United States, including manufacturing. And then from a very pragmatic national security, there's defense. All these critical minerals, though we sometimes don't like to think about it, they're so important for missiles, for aircraft carriers, for submarines. So you have a competition for these minerals and metals as well. But make no mistake, if we're going to be dependent upon green technologies and renewable electricity, we're going to need those. So that's one example. There's also other examples which are less external than internal, and that's really the rural-urban divide. And things that are transitioning for green technologies can exacerbate what we currently have between the rural and urban, or red and blue states. And that can cause national security issues, which we have seen in the past, in our recent past, in our country.
Matthew, you're muted.
Yep. So on the Dynamics Lab website, linked in the description, one of the points you bring up is the roadblocks to success in building renewable energy and creating environmentally friendly policies. When it comes to offshore wind turbines, animals, fisheries, and coastal communities are all impacted by construction. You recently released a groundbreakingly early report providing policymakers science-based recommendations to implement strategies to reduce climate and energy impacts from infrastructure, construction, and building materials, with a focus on urban areas. Can you summarize some of your recommendations for us and explain how our lawmakers can encompass the needs of industries with our need for a sustainable future?
Yeah, that's a lot in that question, so I'll try my best. So first of all, kind of at the 40,000-foot level, Matthew, the issues of roadblocks. And so unlike other countries, we're a land of a lot of regulations and policies, and a lot of regulatory agencies that have a hand in ensuring that environmental and social issues are addressed. So, for instance, other countries, I'll use China again as an example, can quickly develop mines or infrastructure that's required. In the United States, from once you decide you want to start a mine, it could take 16 years till you get your permit. So there's a lot of bureaucracy embedded in the United States that's not as efficient as it could be. You actually see some of the Nordic countries actually streamlining their processes for offshore wind, as an example. So that's one. Two, specifically to your point in, let's say, offshore wind and urban, et cetera, most of the 30 gigawatt of offshore wind is going to be right off of urban areas. That only makes sense because they're the closest demand centers, and they're very large demand centers. You know, you have competition between states, first of all, for this urban infrastructure. That could be steel plants, hopefully in the future being developed through hydrogen, so it's green steel. But you have competition for all these different manufacturing jobs. But then you have local jurisdictions which are being that are not being included enough, in my personal opinion, because they're going to be the ones that provide big areas for laydown yards for this massive equipment. They're going to be the ones that might be dependent on things like tourism and hotels that may or may not be impacted, visual impairments or just traffic or whatever it might be during construction. So there's a lot of issues in that regard as well. I'm not sure I remember the last part of your question, if you can remind me.
Yeah, I'm gonna reread the question. So, can you summarize some of your recommendations for us and explain how our lawmakers can encompass the needs of industries with our need for a sustainable future?
Yeah, so great, thank you. So again, I come back to the first one is we need to have, I think, greater input from our industries as to what the barriers are for them to achieve this, because both government agencies and industry want to move quickly in an effort to create green technologies, renewable electricity, et cetera. I think the administration has done a good job in regard to the financing aspect, but yet much of that financing to help with the infrastructure. So it's one thing for a company to get funding to incentivize. For instance, carbon capture sequestration is incentivized by a tax break, 45Q, which is new. But yet, if we look at these type of infrastructure requirements, the company's not making those additional infrastructure. For instance, electric vehicles requires, let's say, especially for those big trucks, it's going to require new transmission and distribution. So government has to work with the industry to understand where do they make those investments. A community just can't say at every distribution, Amazon warehouse or whatever, we're going to move large electricity to you because it would just be too expensive. So there has to be greater forethought and communication to really help plan in the immediate term moving forward on how to achieve some of these issues. Otherwise, what we'll find is we have manufacturing of, let's say, electric vehicles and electric trucks, but we don't have the charging capacity to make it so they can effectively travel and move goods.
Great. On to the next one. So the blue economy, the sustainable use of our oceans, bolstered 2.5 million jobs and contributes almost 400 billion yearly to our nation's economy. By 2030, the global blue economy could outperform the growth of the entire rest of the global economy. However, this is contributing to an estimated 8 million tons of plastic waste and 1.5 million tons of microplastics entering the oceans every year. COP26 announced the GFANZ initiative, which comprised 450 member firms from the global financial sector representing 130 trillion US dollars in assets under management, pledged to support for a net zero future. How is the rapidly developing blue economy and renewable energy industry affecting ESG and the United States economy? And what is this new sustainable economy doing for us?
Well, it's doing a lot, but let's start with one thing, which is the government has pledged a lot of money, as other governments have, but we haven't actually distributed that money. We haven't been living up to our pledges yet. And when you think about pledges, especially from the US to other countries, you know, there's a lot of countries, I don't like to use the term developing, but we'll use that in this particular case, that don't have the financial capital to make these investments, are dependent upon countries like the US, which have contributed heavily towards global climate change from our past. So we need to do that, first of all. The blue economy is really interesting, and I think is also one of those things that provides great promise, but also risk and unintended consequences. So blue economy is more than just tourism, as you indicated. It could be fishing. Blue economy is supporting now things like offshore wind, but also tidal energy. There are some great projects in Japan, and Oregon State University they're making great strides for that. But it also has these risks. So the Arctic, for instance, has 22% of the global undiscovered, technically feasible fossil fuels. And climate change is opening up the Arctic more and more. Countries from those who are part of the Arctic, as well as those who aren't, China's not connected to the Arctic, have been spending a lot of money on things like nuclear ice-breaking ships. And Russia has been investing in military bases around the Arctic. So there's a race now where we think blue economy, well, it's not necessarily blue because it's going to be fossil fuels, but it could be blue because they're looking at those critical minerals that could be used for the renewable energy, et cetera. And so we have that race. But there's also really exciting things that are happening. So let's take how the blue economy supports other type of aspects. You know, agriculture plays a big part of greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. And one of the biggest contributors is methane. And as the world, the global population increases, it's also becoming more affluent. And as it becomes more affluent, more and more people are going from a vegetarian diet to a meat-based diet around the world. So we're seeing more livestock and more dairy happening. As we know, methane, which is produced from livestock and dairy, is very big. And trying to find ways to reduce that is very difficult. And methane is a much more impactful greenhouse gas. So where have people starting to turn to? The blue economy. So red seaweed is actually something that is being developed that you can put in feed for cattle, livestock, and dairy at very small, like 0.5%, and you can get methane reductions of 12%, 15%. So that's one example of something that people might not be thinking of when they think of the blue economy, but our oceans, our estuaries have incredible opportunities for that. And then again, coming back to those risks, some people are looking at the oceans as potential carbon sinks for carbon capture sequestration. I'm one of those that thinks that should be done with the utmost care and only when we can ensure the safety of aquatic life and ensure that we don't have releases because of earthquakes or whatever other seismic activity as well.
Absolutely. That's fascinating. I didn't know about that. Kind of shifting a little bit, in your report, you largely focused on urban areas, rural divide, which you also touched on earlier in this podcast. Urban areas consume much more energy than rural areas, and many areas are urbanizing rapidly. These urban areas significantly contribute to environmental problems, but don't have the same space to build many types of renewable energy to combat this. Focusing on the United States, can you tell us about how the urban-rural divide has impacted ESG and environmental efforts?
Yeah, so I'll take it as a two-part if that's okay with you, Erica. The first part I'll recognize is the rural-urban divide. So the largest crop we grow in the United States is corn. And 30% or higher, some say over 40% of corn, doesn't go to you and me for feed, doesn't even go to other animals as feed. It goes to our vehicles as ethanol. So our farmers, who many of which most are family farms, who work at the margins, just barely making by sometimes, and at the whim of climate change, right? Drought, wildfires, or maybe it's torrential rain at a very short period of time that just destroy their crops, their livelihood. And now we're telling them, well, we're going to be transitioning from fossil fuel vehicles that require your ethanol, your corn, to electric vehicles, where none of your agriculture is needed right now. Thank you very much. And by the way, most of the electric vehicles are going to the coast and to urban areas where it makes sense. But if you're a farmer and you have to drive such great distances, it doesn't make sense right now for electric vehicles given their range. So that's a real issue, right? We need to be thinking about that. So we need to be, and I'm not saying slow down the EV transition, but we need to be thinking about, well, maybe there are other types of chemicals or apparel or energy sources or packaging that can come from agriculture, forestry, and crops and croplands. And let's incentivize our farmers to do that. And let's get lower greenhouse gas footprints on our products through agriculture, which the government's starting to do. But those are that's an example. Urban areas are also unique. I really liked your intro into it in regards to limitations on space. We hope that there's limitations on space because the more you sprawl, right, the more asphalt and concrete that we're consuming. And we know cement is a major greenhouse gas contributor. You know, it's interesting. Transportation in the United States is the largest sector for greenhouse gas emissions. Every state follows suit, basically, except one, New York State, where buildings are the largest contributor. And in New York City, buildings contribute 70% of greenhouse gas emissions. And that's no different than, let's say, Singapore, Hong Kong, and other major cities. So we need to find ways to counter the impacts. So part of it's going to be that 30 gigawatt of offshore wind and using clean, renewable electricity instead of fossil fuel, natural gas or coal, but also, and this is a tough one for a lot of people, switching out our gas stoves, which I love for cooking, to electric stoves, right? That now people are really feeling it. It's not in the abstract. The Environmental Protection Agency just got funding under the Inflation Reduction Act. So they're creating what's called environmental product declarations and eco labels for building and construction materials in an effort to have a label so that then the government will require it for their construction jobs and buildings, but also cities and states and just companies. Walmart, I come back to them just because they're interesting for me in many ways, built a new campus in Bentonville, Arkansas, and it's not a steel campus of buildings, but rather it's mass timber. So they're trying innovative solutions as well. And they're obviously not the only ones. So it is going to call for a lot of people and architects and engineers and planners to think through how we do this. And we have this thing called Jevons paradox, where an example being I buy a new computer and it says it's Energy Star and it uses less energy. Well, now I might be thinking, well, I'll just leave it plugged in overnight because it's Energy Star. Well, the same thing can be true for electric vehicles. Well, I've got an electric vehicle so I can drive more. I don't need to take mass transit. Well, there's still a lot of greenhouse gas, a lot of energy, a lot of materials are used for our cars. So we should definitely not be backing away from mass transit, but in fact be thinking of ways we can make cleaner mass transit and importantly, more accessible and affordable mass transit for people. I live part-time in Chapel Hill and all the buses are free and they're low emission vehicles. And so I take pride in that.
Kind of following up on that, with this rural-urban divide being such a significant part to making a better future, how can we work to bridge this gap both as citizens but also as lawmakers and in the government?
Yeah, I mean, it is, and the example I gave was just the United States, but we can look at migration because we see migration for people moving from rural to urban areas. China is a great example. What's happening in Africa is also an example of what's going on. Some of it's climate induced because of drought and impacting it. So you are seeing some of the investments now for, let's say, large battery manufacturing or even new EV manufacturing under the CHIPS Act for semiconductor manufacturing, which is needed for our clean tech transition, being invested in rural areas. The problem is workforce. Can you get the workforce? So there has to be a lot of effort placed on community colleges and K through 12 to start training people for the jobs of the future. It's really important. So that's one example. The other is we still need broadband. You can look at a map. The US government does a map, I think it's USDA, of where there's broadband service. And when you look at the map, it looks like the country is covered. Well, it's a little bit misleading because that area might have one tower and it might only hit 3 homes, but that area is considered covered where 90% may not be actually covered by it. So we need to still have some social equity, if you will, and make these investments in needed infrastructure like broadband that's required for everything, right? texting to our family and loved ones, to education, to training, all of it is necessary. And companies aren't going to locate where there's not broadband service. And that's one example.
Absolutely. Thank you. Lastly, we at Change the Chamber at www.changethechamber.org or in the description love to empower youth to become involved in solving our climate crisis and improving our environmental quality. You as well note one of your goals is preparing students to become future leaders. What can the youth in our country do to support ESG and bridge the rural-urban divide?
Oh, it's a great question. You guys, I'm envious. Man, I really wish I was back like 22 years old right now. You guys have so much, your generation has so much opportunity and influence to really change the world for the better, where my generation has fallen flat. So how can it be done? So let me kind of explain a few things, or give my thoughts, I should say. So one is, when I come back to you have these great opportunities. Our lab, this is my third year. I'm a junior here at Syracuse, right, as a faculty member, and I love it. We have almost 100% placement for all of our students, most of them who work in the lab. We have about 50 students that work in the lab prior to their graduation, undergrad and grad, because they're focused on trying to get the skills needed. So some of those are just inherent project management skills, but what is greenhouse gas accounting? How do I do it? How are companies managing? What does ESG really mean? Because as you started this whole discussion, all these companies are committing to net zero and ESG, but they don't know how to get there. And they need a workforce. And so they're dying to hire them. So just getting those skills in that network. How can you make a difference? You are the consumer. Being really thoughtful and looking at products and companies. We do an exercise. I take all my students in my class and we go to a mall and they have to look at sustainable products, unsustainable products, photograph them, then look at the companies and their sustainability reports. Are they transparent? It makes a light bulb go up. And then they do reports and they report back to, I find the sustainability vice president for the companies. And they give their perception and their reports to them. And sometimes it works, but it's that continued forcefulness. Universities and pensions and companies, and in the future, you guys are going to be doing 401ks, everything else. Those are the big investors, shareholders of these companies, and shareholders in the financial institutions are really pushing companies to move more towards ESG and make these commitments and follow up. And when CEOs don't, they're out. So it's really raising the awareness, and you have, unlike any generation, the ability for your social media skills is incredible, and leverage them and use them and take advantage of it and make sure people change and organizations change. But then you also have to change some of your habits. I mean, many of us, for instance, are really bad with fast fashion, for instance. And I encourage your listeners to look up, just Google fast fashion and Chile, the country. And you will see reports and photographs of a desert full of abandoned fast fashion clothing because there's no place to recycle it, reuse it. And that's something that, like you talked about plastics as well. I'm sitting next to my recycled aluminum water jug, right? It's these little things, but they add up. So that kind of awareness we need to be thinking about.
Amazing. Thanks for your insight. That dynamics lab sounds really cool. I wish I did that kind of work when I was an undergrad. But yeah, I just want to thank you once again for joining us. It was a pleasure to get to know you and hear about transparency, ESG, and the future of the environmental economy. And to wrap up this episode, we'd like to give our guests 60 seconds to just pitch or share anything you're working on, what you're excited about, or anything you'd like to share. The floor is yours.
Well, thanks. The only thing I'll say is one of our teams in the lab is actually working to develop a program where student teams can be interns and support, especially smaller and mid-sized local government and communities in small businesses with a focus on underserved communities and underserved businesses, and be those folks that are kind of their de facto sustainability offices and help them in their transition, whether it's EVs or net zero or environmental justice. And our goal is to have a guidebook for that and to then engage universities across the country. This isn't a Syracuse alone. We want student leaders to get the hands-on practical experience, develop the skills, develop the knowledge, and be those change agents. So for anybody listening that eventually would like to take this to your campus, we would love to share everything that we have and encourage you and your university to become those change agents for good.
Great. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Jay Golden, for joining us. And to our listeners, thank you for listening to this episode of Let's Talk About Climate. Before you go, don't forget to like us, subscribe, and rate us 5 stars on your podcast platform. It really helps us out. Follow us on Instagram at Let's Talk About Climate Pod and Twitter at Talk Climate Pod, and check out our website, changethechamber.org. You can find all the links we talked about today in the description. With that, this was Let's Talk About Climate. Have a nice day. Thanks for joining us.